Get that. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Shauna Hirschfield. I am class of 2006, and I am the Associate Director for the Hamilton Career Network. The Hamilton Career Network at the HCN was launched this past fall as a way to help alumni and other alums and students connect with each other around their careers. So we're really pleased to have you all with us today. Before we get into the formal event, I want to take just a minute to run through the mechanics of how all of this will work. Everyone should have audio and video privileges. You were muted automatically when you joined us, but you can feel free to unmute yourself during the conversation if you'd like to. Feel free also to raise your hand or to type questions directly into the chat window, and we'll monitor those questions throughout. And we'll jump in mid-conversation if it makes sense to, and may bank some questions to have at the end as well. Another important note of business, if everyone could please change your name so that it's your first and your last name, and feel free to include your class here as well. If you don't know how to do that, you can go to the participant list, hover over your name and click on the More button, and then say rename, and you should have privileges to change it to your first and last name. And if you have any difficulty, feel free to message me directly and I can update that for you. Now we're going to get started with the formal program. So Julie Bernard, class of 92, is part of our Hamilton Career Network volunteer team. It is and heads up our STEM network. So Julie really coordinated everything today to make this program today possible. So thanks to Julie for your efforts to make this happen today. And with that, I will hand it over to Julie to introduce our panelists.
All right, great. Thanks, Shauna. I appreciate it. Thanks to everybody for joining us today for our noontime lunch and learn on a topic I think you'll find very interesting, and insights and perspectives from our two panelists that I really do think will either terrify you or give you comfort and joy maybe in these difficult times. As Shauna said, I do want to encourage everyone to send in questions. Again, give me a little note. Both Shauna and I will be looking out for that, or type it into the chat box. We'll pay attention to it, and we'll try to make it very much a discussion in the moment as opposed to a lecture. While we are sponsored and supported by the Hamilton Career Network, let's not make this feel like school. Let's kind of enjoy each other's company for the next hour or so. We will begin with introductions. I will start with myself just to set up a little bit of context for my background and why this particular topic is one near and dear to my heart, and why I reached out to both Jim and Stu for their partnership in joining us today for today's panel. My career has been dominantly in retail and consumer goods since graduating from Hamilton, with a specialty really in customer strategy and behavioral analytics, consumer data intelligence and behaviors, yet for the purpose really of, pretty innocuous things, selling pink cashmere sweaters, promoting them, marketing, advertising. I also, though, do have a background in marketing and advertising technology and a lot of digital transformation initiatives. So the use of consumer data, personally identifiable information, and other highly sensitive data, credit data, things of that nature, is something that's always very interesting to me. And in particular, as we've had this onslaught of the novel coronavirus and COVID-19 becoming a part of our common human experience over these recent months, I've been particularly interested in the topics around the responsible and ethical use of highly sensitive data for contact tracing, immunity passports, risk-free certifications, the implications some of us were chatting before we formally began about data security and cybersecurity in the context of distributed workforces, working from home, going back into the office. So there are a lot of really interesting topics. And I thought, who better to help us understand the unique unease and data sensitivities and security implications than Jim Dinneen and Stu Ingis, who have agreed to join us today and be our panelists for this conversation. And who better to introduce themselves? I am actually going to pass it over first to you, Jim, and then you, Stu. Tell us a little bit about your background, not only for context for your expertise in today's conversation, yet also to inspire anyone here who is looking to think about a career shift or new entry. I didn't really look to see who we have on, but I always think that setting up a little bit about our career journeys can be interesting. So Jim, how about we go to you first?
Thanks so much, Julie. Appreciate it. And very glad to be part of this panel and to be talking to you here with Stu, a real expert in this field. So it's wonderful for everyone to join. So my name's Jim Dinneen. I was the class of 2005. I wound up in this field through a bit of a circuitous route, but basically I wound up down in Washington, D.C., working in the federal government for an incredible boss, Cam Carey, is the general counsel at the Department of Commerce. I spent a couple of years there reinvigorating the interagency internet policy task force, and our first sort of big endeavor on that was looking at privacy, an effort that led to a White House Privacy Bill of Rights, an endorsement of the executive for the type of privacy protections that were needed for folks in this digital age. From there, I went over to the Department of Homeland Security, where I worked in the private sector office and basically liaised with business for a range of issues, everything from aviation security to trade facilitation to cybersecurity. So really handling sort of the other side of the coin. What was internet policy at Commerce became cybersecurity policy at DHS, and had the chance to sort of learn the depth of these issues and really experience all that the federal government was bringing to the table in this policy area. So sort of firsthand education on that front. Came back to Boston in 2017, worked for the Northeastern Cybersecurity and Privacy Institute, facilitating our faculty and the research that they were doing in these fields. So helping to think about how internet IoT devices were connecting and collecting data on their owners, and what that data collection, aggregation, and transmittal storage looked like, the privacy implications that what you could divine about a person. So some really interesting research on that, and now I'm focused on that. Can help one another, learn from one another, and really root out some of the malicious activity that's out there, and be a trusted network for helping one another respond to the many challenges that are out there. So I'm very happy to be talking about today. So thank you.
Stu.
Great. Well, I'm here because Julie asked me to be here. But it's great to be on a panel with Jim. We discovered in this process we have many of the same connections and friends from over the years. I guess I could say that I did get started. I can blame Hamilton for all of what I'm doing. I got started down this path in a conversation before the first week of school when upperclassmen encouraged me to take the American political process with Ted Eismeyer, and that led me to a semester in Washington and ultimately to law school. And work that I did in law school, kind of pre-internet, for Professor Law of the Information Superhighway, an author of that book for Professor and some companies, led me back to Washington, where I've been representing a who's who kind of internet companies and businesses, large and small, for 20 plus years on data issues, advertising issues, marketing issues. And in that context, I've represented, I think, all of the big internet companies and a lot of the trade associations, which those of you who know Washington know that's how a lot of policy gets made in developing standards for data and privacy in conjunction with the government. And while there are not a ton of rules in the privacy area specific, there is a lot of industry self-regulation. Much of it has been written by the clients that I represent, and we've spent a lot of time working on those things, including efforts, one called the Digital Advertising Alliance, known as the DAA, that little blue chevron you may see in internet ads. but that's a creation of the entire kind of technology internet ad industry that gives consumers choices to things. And we were the counsel to that effort, and more recently working on an effort called Privacy for America, which is an effort of many of kind of Fortune 100 companies trying to figure out an appropriate federal legislative response in the privacy area. So I'll stop there. And I guess I should say in the background, I am a partner and chairman at the Venable law firm.
Great. Well, thanks, Stu, and thanks, Jim, for giving some background. And as Stu said, too, we've met actually through the Direct Marketing Association, one of those trade associations that is notable in the use of data for advertising in particular. And we met back when I worked for a large department store, Macy's, yet also have stayed connected through the industry over the years. My most recent company, I'm going to use this to set up kind of our first and get going. I worked for a technology platform for mobile advertising. And our secret sauce, lots of people serve ads, in apps. We were one of those people. We probably helped brands, the top 100 spenders, globally, serve advertising in about 40 to 50,000 apps that are on our mobile devices. Yet our secret sauce, our value proposition, if you will, was that we had access to anonymized mobile device IDs and the latitude and the longitude of those phones at multiple times throughout the day. And based on that, to Jim's point before, you could define a lot about a person based on where they went. We could see that you visited a dog park on a Saturday at 10 a.m., add an attribute to the phone, presence of dog. You went to an elementary school every day at 7:30 in the morning. You went back at 3 o'clock, adult with presence of young child. You went to the elementary school at 7 a.m., you left at 6, teacher or administrator in the elementary school, attribute on the record. You went to, a movie theater, those types of things. So fairly innocuous, particularly when used for simple advertising, helping Procter & Gamble sell more Pantene shampoo in the ESPN app. Think of it that way. And we could track, though, we were a small company, only about 125 million in revenue, but we could track 90% of the phones in the United States at that level of granularity. And as Stu mentioned, dominantly really using self-regulatory guidelines, because we could also, if one wanted, yet we chose not to, collect data for visits to liquor stores or meth clinics or mental health clinics and hospitals and things of that nature. But you did so in a self-regulatory way. And there are different activities out there right now for federal privacy action and some different things happening at the state level. So we'll explore some of those today. Yet related then to where we are with COVID-19 and some of the topics that, as I mentioned, we are now almost becoming expert in with contact tracing and some of these other things. What has been out there for decades, frankly, the use of sensitive consumer data for various use cases in many, many different industries, is now something that is bringing some concern and has a new state of awareness, if you will, and certainly coverage in our national media space. With contact tracing, I'm going to read something from the CDC right now to set us up definition-wise on what we're talking about, and then use that. Stu, I'll give you kind of the heads up that when I'm done with my definition, I'll start with you to help us think about why we're even having this dialogue. And from your perspective and the conversations you've had, a sense of at the strategic kind of 30,000 foot level right now, where is this unease coming from? So to start, with contact tracing, again, just for all of us to be on the same page, it's all about the need to track down anyone who might have been infected by a person who was recently diagnosed with coronavirus COVID-19, so that that person can self-quarantine and prevent further spread. So the CDC reports in contact tracing, public health staff are working with a patient to help them recall everyone with whom they've had close contact during the time frame while they might have been infectious. The contact is provided with education, information, and support to understand their risk, what they should do to separate themselves from others who are not exposed, monitor themselves for illness, and the possibility that they could spread the infection to others, even if they themselves do not feel ill. The CDC reports that they admit it's an arduous task, but they credit contact tracing with helping to stop SARS 2004 epidemic. So this has been going on for a long time. This is not a new idea, although the scale that we're talking about now is perhaps new. Yet today it's being done dominantly manually with small groups of people, but there's a movement to expand both the quantity of people participating in contact tracing, sometimes referred to as these contact tracing armies, yet also using technology to facilitate scale and the timely distribution of relevant information that we need. And so it has created this kind of tension between what's good for the common good in terms of public health and safety, yet also what are our rights as individuals from a privacy standpoint. So Stu, maybe we can start with you and you can give us a sense of, why is this a concern when this has been happening for a long time? Sensitive data are used all the time. Why do you think that this is something that's getting a lot of attention?
Well, I think it's a concern in large part driven by what people kind of what they understand and what they don't understand. I think there's a general, not a widespread understanding of how data is collected and used about consumers, and generally in a very responsible way by reputable companies that kind of make the good decisions and follow good codes, and a fear that of data being used in ways that could hurt them somehow. And some of it is just the notion we've heard of a lot in the advertising industry. When you get an advertisement about a product or service you might be interested in based on somewhere you've been along the lines Julie described, but that people, I think there is a sense in the population that people find it, the word they use is creepy, that somehow people would know their whereabouts without them sharing it or disclosing it. So you've got this tremendous advance in technology that's benefited the public under any question, but has brought with it this underlying change in expectations and use of data and privacy debate that's been going on, and it winds up being applied in this situation, which I think is challenging because I think it limits the potential for saving lives and for using modern day technologies to an old practice that dates back centuries. So it's a challenge, and so you have this particular dynamic playing into the broader debate about the role of technology and use of data in a modern society.
Jim, any thoughts on that from your perspective when you're talking to your clients at the center? And
I mean, we have the technology to get ahead of what is, a world-changing pandemic. And so it just makes sense to use the tools that we have at our fingertips. And I think that, the prospect of the aggregation of data is probably one that's a bit daunting to folks. But, you think you give up your email address for that 10% off, you give up your phone number for your CVS rewards, you give up your birth date for your Starbucks drink, right? Your free birthday drink. So we, throughout the course of our daily lives, have been, turning over pieces of our data. It's what, keeps the internet free. It's what allows our credit cards to be free because, they have sophisticated fraud programs that they can know when you're spending somewhere that you wouldn't typically spend, and be able to identify that in near real time. So I would say, we currently use a lot of, what would be considered privacy protected data for our day-to-day lives for the sake of convenience. And I think that, here it's should be thought of similarly. I think the prospect of, aggregating that and putting it in the context of everyone that you've seen in the last 2 weeks and people that you've interacted with is where it starts to bring it home that there's a potential invasion of who you are and who you interact with. But at the same time, until we have a vaccine, it seems like, a readily available tool to save lives.
Yeah.
Julie, could I add something there? So it's interesting. I agree with everything Jim said. And one of the things we've seen historically, if you think about the advertising industry and all the benefits that and the types of things and promotions Jim just described, the general framework, non-legal framework, has been one of giving consumers notice about what you do, and either giving them an opt-out, a choice to say, I don't want you to use my information for that purpose, or in cases of sensitive information, we won't use your information unless you give us an opt-in affirmative consent. And so when you map that to what's happened in the policy world, in the Congress, the knee-jerk reaction of policymakers has been to apply that model here. And the challenge with that is, as a general matter, what human behavior has shown us, particularly where you have, particularly now, and as opposed to maybe 15 years ago where data is so ubiquitous, is consumers generally don't opt in or opt out of anything. So the percentages are very low. Very few will opt out of something that they might otherwise not be interested in if you really pushed them. And they won't opt into something that would otherwise be probably a tremendous benefit for them. So we sent a kind of proposal and letter to various people, relevant people in the Congress early on, not on behalf of clients, but just recognizing these facts to see if there was an area we may be able to be helpful in making progress for the country and tied to the scenario. And the Congress was already back to their opt-in or opt-out scenario. And some of the technology companies that were rolling this out were in that scenario, mainly because they were concerned, this is my projection, but I think probably accurate, with whether they'd have liability for data that was used in ways that they wouldn't be, or that they'd get consumer blowback the way that they get in other uses of data if you look and think of the size of the companies. And the way you would really achieve the level of benefit that these track and tracing worked if you did the analog to the non-technology world is it would just be required. You wouldn't actually give consumers that choice because you need 80, 90%, depending on the measurements of participation. And so you wind up with a bunch of legislative proposals, none of which actually are aimed at how would you solve the problem. They're all focused around just the historical ways that privacy has been debated in the country.
Mm-hmm. So you raise a good point though then. So the opt-in, opt-out, you're right. People are, I always say they're fundamentally lazy. Nobody's paying attention. I think because I spent the last 5 years doing a lot of this tracking, I have everything shut up. Bluetooth's not on unless I need it. Location's off on all apps all the time. I'm a bit of a psycho. I change passwords daily. I have a password generator. but I'm in industry, so you definitely maybe just know too much, right? I'm like, they don't need to have that information to serve me a promotion for buy one, get one. Jim, to your point about the types of data. Yet I don't know if people necessarily believe some of the protections, Stu, that are in place, either in a self-regulatory way or from a government perspective. I often, in the past 5 years, as I would be on the speaker circuit, would find audience members surprised when I would say that even though we captured in my company first-party mobile device ID data, that we could associate it with households. And so the minute you can associate a phone with almost certainty with your place of residence and also work, it's really not that anonymized anymore because I can easily match it in various environments to do things, right? And so to your point, we did it for advertising. We would match with your smart TV. We would know an ad that you saw in an ad-supported service on your TV and then retarget you on your phone. If it was a Toyota ad that ran on your TV, maybe Ford would buy that data point so that they could serve you a Ford ad on the phone, some of those types of different things. But people I don't know if they believe that the data really is anonymized and that their information is being protected. And in the case of kind of coming back to the CDC, they were talking about how even in contact tracing, from a process standpoint, some of the questions, this was reported on CNN Health, that a patient reported the following story. She got home from the hospital 2 hours after she had tested, or actually had COVID, recovered. She got a call from her county health department, and a long list of questions followed. Who have you seen in the last 2 weeks? Where were you in the last 2 weeks? Who are you in contact with? Where do you work? Where have you gone? And after that, her coworkers had to be contacted. So did a restaurant where she had gone for lunch and a hair salon that she had visited. And also those who sat near her at a Cleveland Cavaliers game. But when the contacts were notified, they were not told who it was that was diagnosed with coronavirus. To protect patient privacy, the CDC said that contacts are only informed that they may have been exposed to a patient with the infection. They are not told the identity of the patient who may have exposed them. You know, Stu, you mentioned kind of the communication, the broad knowledge, the education. Is this enough in terms of both privacy and even data safety? Just kind of trusting that this process is really right?
Yeah. So I think the key word there is trust, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really the you know, if you really want to know what the challenge is, I mean, the Congress and those proposals are reflecting what they're hearing from their constituents.
Yeah.
And the constituents don't have trust. I'm not sure that they have a lack of trust. They just don't know what to trust and where. And I think if the public felt that the data would be collected just for those purposes, deleted, held for just amount of that time, there wouldn't be any issue. But I think people don't know whether they can trust the technology providers. Can they trust the government? Can they trust the local government? And that's a challenge, right? Because we're not going to be able to restore trust around these issues in the time required to save lives or get the benefits of the technologies. To me, you know, it's interesting. I have the kind of different reaction from you. Maybe it goes to the company, Julie, you were working with, but I've kind of have the opposite approach on data. I have worked with enough companies and really do have the trust because I see the responsibility that they put to these, to the use and things of data. So I don't have real concerns, and maybe I just don't do anything bad. Maybe that's the other issue, but I don't have concerns with my data being out there in the same way. So I don't have the lack of trust. To me, I think everybody should be willing to recognize the benefits that happen here. And we can have debates about whether you should get a relevant Toyota ad or not. And those are going to continue for years. But here you're talking about life and death. Yeah. And so, you know, from my perspective, what we should be debating as a Congress or as a society would be, how long do you preserve the data? What's it used for? What are the limits of the use? Who can use the data, right? You know, as a large employer, I worry about being able to know whether the work environment we have is safe, and can I use that data for those purposes? So I'd put it in the hands of the government. I would trust the government, but clearly, you know, a large portion of the public doesn't.
Yeah, well, you know, and Stu, Jim, I'm going to give the next question to you, but let me set it up a minute, kind of building off of what Stu just said, because I think one of the things that's interesting here is this trust piece. That a lot of times it comes down to individuals and our individual behaviors and actions, right? So you're not really trusting government, kind of capital G. You're not trusting, you know, society. It's people that have to make these decisions, and that's where, you know, Stu, some of the, you know, so many people in these different contexts from an advertising standpoint. Most people are good actors, but here and there you have a bad actor. And frankly, in my prior role, many times I had to shut down some big advertisers like Netflix with things they wanted to do that they thought were cool, that you were just like, yeah, that's actually not okay. Big law firms that wanted us to see when the phone went from 70 miles an hour down to 0 so that we could target family members, you know, new way of doing kind of ambulance chasing. So interesting things, but it's really people, right, that still have to make these good decisions. And then to your point about, you know, where does this happen? Where is it executed at state or federal levels or individual organizations? I read a piece about North Dakota, their Department of Health not really having the resources to do contact tracing. And so they have a public-private partnership with an app developer in North Dakota who has created an app for tracing bison. And they're using this individual in partnership with the North Dakota Department of Health to help them apply the principles of this bison tracking app to use it for contact tracing in that state. Now, certainly one could say it's clever and it's innovative and it's a nice public-private partnership, But I don't know the guy that built the bison tracking app in North Dakota. Back to the individuals I try to trust. But, Jim, maybe you can speak a little bit about as we know, everyone's getting into this game. You have the big guys that we all know, Apple and Google and many others. And then you have the guy in North Dakota who does bison tracking. How should we think about this kind of, interesting approach and this massive public-private partnership to address this public health crisis?
So I really think it has to be a whole of nation and actually a global response. I mean, the nature of the disease is it doesn't stop at state borders. It doesn't stop at international borders, right? We shut down travel to China and still had, tens of thousands of people going back and forth between the United States and China. The amount of commercial flights, international commercial flights, are basically halved at this point from where they were last year. So people are going to continue to flow, and you really need the ability to do this on a national level. So the one guy who's good at bison tracking in North Dakota, that's great, but there are going to be plenty of people coming and going from that state. Even with stay-at-home and lockdown orders, people are still, restless creatures and going to move. So, I really think that the response to it needs to come from a robust, federal effort. And, in thinking about the challenges that presents, I just think to some examples of where we already entrust, troves of incredibly valuable data to the government, right? From our passports to the census. And, in the case of the census, that information is protected by statute for what it can be used for, how it can be accessed, and it is very specifically set off from law enforcement. And I think that, you have the right to be concerned about, how information is aggregated and how it could be used in other contexts that would get beyond, the immediate challenge here of responding to a pandemic. But, thinking about the largesse of the problem and the solutions that we need to get our arms around what is currently, a wildfire that's out of control. It's massive. And, there is a real path to returning to normalcy, and it includes, robust testing, contact tracing program that lets you stay ahead of outbreaks and be able to be very narrow in your lockdowns, and universal mask wearing. And, those three simple steps other countries have undertaken and have been very successful in knocking this down and being able to get back to some semblance of normalcy. And, just thinking about the challenge that lies ahead for the fall and what, what the prospect of no school looks like for countless tired parents who need to now, do 2-3 extra jobs of teaching their children. It's some daunting prospects out there. And, again, I go back to if you have the central authority that can collect for a very specific purpose, recognize that there is a very specific duration, and, create the repository that you can unleash innovation where you have lots of different folks who can draw on that information and help you develop, the most effective contact tracing apps. I think, there's a lot of knowledge in the advertising industry about how to aggregate and to be able to stay ahead of the curve here, and give the folks who are the public health officials at the local level the tools they need to fight this and to be able to get us someplace comfortable for the next, 6, 12 months, however long a vaccine takes to manufacture for 330 million Americans.
Well, it's interesting, the central authority piece of it. And then Stu, the next question, put it to you, maybe for a short answer, because you probably have a yes, no to it. But then we have lots of questions coming in on our group chat. So I'll start with a couple of those that are posed to both of you, actually. So, but related to the central authority concept, or at least an organizing, if not execution layer, if you will, should it just be mandatory? Kind of not negotiable. We're in, unusual, unprecedented times. because then you could start to do things just even with the carriers of the device manufacturers, right?
Yeah, I know it's controversial, but I think in my view, there's no question that it should be mandatory. I just think it's a clear solution. You have to put rules and parameters around it. But, and I'll give you one just thought on it, which is if you step back, people say, well, you should have to opt into this because otherwise somehow it's taking away a civil liberty. I just don't really buy that. I get the point, but, most of us have been locked down for 4 months, and locked in your house that's taken away civil liberties. Saying that somebody can have information on your phone about whether you had COVID for, 3 weeks, that to me is not to allow that is not taking away a civil liberty, particularly if it's going to save many lives and get us back to the world that Jim described.
Right. All right, so I have a bunch of, oh, sorry, Jim, go, because then we have a bunch of questions for you coming in from folks.
I was just going to put to the interesting proposals that I've heard for the contact tracing, the delineation between the use of GPS and the use of Bluetooth, and the goal being to preserve privacy. That GPS does give away a lot of other personal identifying PII, and so thinking about how you could do the same with Bluetooth that enables you to tell the duration and the distance you are from another phone. And looking at the stats, I think Pew Research said that 81% of Americans have smartphones. So if you're at a place where you're able to roll this out, you can very quickly start to get ahead of the curve and be able to knock this down.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. In fact, this is definitely, and it ties to one of the questions that someone asked. There's no question that both of you and me from my background, we're probably closer to it. I'm a big believer in even some of the tech folks, maybe they can start to use edge computing and things like that so that the sensitive data never leave the device. Just leave anything sensitive on the device and just take the result of it and do what you need to do. But we're getting way too techy and technical, but we're all in, I think, the same place. Make it mandatory, figure out technology to do it, put some parameters around it. One question we have from one of our panel audience members here, Stu and Jim, you're uniquely knowledgeable about the issue. Your consent is worth something. Do we think most Americans understand the definition of what is personally identifiable information? It goes a little bit, Stu, back to you in terms of education. It's ignorance, not ignorance stupid, just ignorance, lack of knowledge. And how could we solve for that, thinking maybe that most people don't?
Yeah, I think most people don't. I think if you're solving for this particular scenario, you define the type of information that's being collected and used and the protections around it. There are a lot of innovative ways and innovative thinking as to how to protect some of that data and pseudonymize it, which may be a way to further trust.
Right. And here's a question, maybe Jim, you can speak to a little bit of this, or really both of you. Person says, what I am wondering, is anyone else concerned about the abuse of the technology? I don't actually know many people who are concerned about contact tracing for COVID purposes. The concern that this individual has encountered is the abuse of using the tracing for other purposes beyond the time of COVID, especially if the government is involved in any way. I'd love to know if there is a response that I can share with people in my life who have expressed these concerns.
I mean, I think it's a real concern. I was at the Department of Homeland Security and trying to convince companies to work with us on an automated indicator sharing system where they would say, or they would share in near real time what they were seeing out there, what was attacking their systems on a very technical level. And there was just a lot of, skepticism or reluctance to sort of move forward on a program because it was right in the wake of Edward Snowden and the revelation of a lot of relationships that folks didn't understand the depth of or appreciate, how information was flowing. And so, I think that it's not unreasonable to begin with a basis of trust, but I'd go back to the other aspect that we do already entrust a lot of very sensitive data to the government, and with the proper statutory requirements, it can be protected, right? I used the census example earlier. I think, the fact is that the sort of two paths I see, and maybe it's a lack of sort of creativity, but you either have, the government where you can have legislators sort of set the terms of it and really specifically determine the duration, or you have, the private sector where you could have it wind up, like the next iteration of a credit scoring bureau, right? Where it's out there, there's trusted entity that abides by sort of industry standards. They do everything right, but they have, ultimately a profit motive to continue sort of beyond the time of COVID. So
that's a good example, Jim. I agree with everything you said. I want to build on just one thing, which is, if the worry is abuse, I think it's as you say, a clear and legitimate worry. But there are ways as a society, to limit that, right? That's what laws do at all levels. And there are different types of laws and different strengths. What we had proposed that the Congress consider was something to limit the potential for abuse. And you see that in the credit bureau area. I think that's the perfect analogy, where there's oversight and examination authority. And you could even, because none of this exists right now, you build in an approval process that certain checks and balances and certain things had to be put in place, particularly around security. And then you have oversight, whether it's third-party validation or oversight that you see that is brought to the security system by, public accounting, or you have oversight in government regulators that exist, for example, in the CFPB. The CFPB has government regulators that have oversight authority that go in and kick the tires on the practices of the credit bureaus to make sure that they're doing what they should be doing with the data. You could do that here.
You could, and I think the oversight piece, and then the overarching guidelines, and then the implementation and the adherence to those guidelines then in both in the private sector. Then there's a question in the group chat that kind of gets into some of the use cases and the application of the adherence to such guidelines in the context of going back to school. So the question is, you've spoken a lot about the government can use the data to track COVID spreads. Do you see higher education institutions using similar location tracking to keep students, faculty safe once they return to campus? Northeastern University is creating an app to track who is in class, when, and where they travel around campus and Boston. Do you think higher education institutions should create COVID apps to prevent community spread on campus? And I should say, I'll extend this. This is, the question is around campuses, but I have actually heard of this for going back to offices as well. I believe Rockefeller Center in New York City has an app that you have to have installed on your phone as a prerequisite of going back to the office for
So
things.
I think
going back to places.
I think Jim had it right when he was talking about the fact that you need a national approach and national policy, and I think it applies here. So in a university or college scenario, the type of testing is only as good as everybody within the universe of the testing. So at Hamilton, you could create the bubble, so to speak, and have testing around the bubble in a way that would be pretty effective, and there are, and if you morph that then into the workplace by comparison, like PwC has an app that's aimed at doing just this, that they're offering to, clients, employees. My guess is the other accounting firms are doing the same thing. In the employment context, though, everybody then goes home at night, right? And so if it doesn't apply broadly to the rest of my family, or my kids go to school, the rest of their schools, the tracking and tracing is harder and more limited. So those, microcosms I think are useful, but they all have to be done in as part of a more holistic approach.
So it's a good segue into the next question about the holistic approach. One of our guests says, do we know why there hasn't been a national contact tracing system developed that states and jurisdictions could use. States and jurisdictions are having to create their own systems at great expense. Any insights into why we are leaving this as such a distributed?
Jim, I'll let you take that one.
You both have big PC background. Yeah, Jim, you go.
There are diplomatic way to say this.
We're both on the same party, and it's not the one in charge.
Yeah, it's frustrating because, as I said earlier, this knows no bounds and will travel across state boundaries, across national boundaries, quickly, easily. We do an incredible amount of commerce with Mexico and with Canada, and even though the borders are shut there, there's still trade flow that needs to go across there, and there's people associated with that. I think that you've seen an adaptation by the localities. You've seen governors band together to create regional alliances to help ease some of the burdens here. The whole Northeast sort of got together, and it meant that they could say that folks could travel between the immediate states where the situation was very different from what's happening in the Sun Belt and the Southwest. And I think that, until the federal government steps forward to fill that void, it's going to be up to the folks in state government, in these regional alliances to fill the void. And it's a challenge because it means that it is not a wholesome solution. It means that you're going to get a lot of different takes as to what works and what doesn't, and I think that's really important. First time we're seeing this type of event, so no one's necessarily well versed in how to create this type of a national program, how to create this scale of national testing. And even we still struggle with the production of PPE. So I'd say that there is a saddening lack of leadership or creativity, but we have plenty of folks in the private sector who do this innovative work, and that's my whole career in government and since has been about facilitating public-private partnership and building those collaborations. And I really see, the need to get the folks who are the innovators to be able to create these programs, to give them the guidelines, to focus on privacy, ensure that it's protected, find ways to do this constructively. So give them the right sort of incentive structure, and then to partner that with, the specific government capabilities that they have that private industry doesn't. So I don't know, dancing around it a little, but it's frustrating and sad.
Well, there's another question that I'll ask that I'll set up a little bit with some other information that I had, someone had shared with me in preparing for today's panel. The question is, first I'll read it just so we have it. Any ideas on dealing with COVID-19 related online disinformation? This seems like a substantial issue that may need tackling. And just one example, and it kind of gets back into what are my rights and whether or not we even understand what our rights are. But a chief HR officer at a biotech firm in California had a C-level executive at their company refused to have their temperature checked when they started to go back to the office recently, in the past couple of weeks. The head of HR said, well, you have to. We've put together a policy, we have procedures to coming back safely. So fast forward, person refuses, they go into the office. Fast forward a couple days, this individual actually does have an elevated temperature. The head of HR asks the individual to not come into the office, go home, work from home, self-quarantine for 14 days, yet then shared with some coworkers that someone was going to be out, that there was a risk in the workplace, somebody had an elevated temperature, was going to go be tested. And the individual was all about, well, I've heard, online, I've heard in the news. So to the, person's question about disinformation, I've heard that that's a violation of my healthcare rights, the data, my health data and my privacy rights. So how do we, really distribute and communicate at scale information that is accurate and helps people be more comfortable? How do we start to tackle this, right? Because your point, current covered, situation, putting it aside, right? Contact tracing has been around since 2004. So we've had lots of administrations that could have said, this is really important, put together a national contact tracing system. It's not only now a situation. How do we start to deal with these things with online disinformation and understanding?
Well, I'll jump in first. I think that the disinformation piece is a real problem. And I think that not to go full conspiracy in responding to conspiracies, but our adversaries are certainly using this against us and exploiting divisions within our society, and easily just picking at some of these scabs. So it is a real persistent problem, and it really sort of comes down to the individual responsibility to be able to verify the sources that you're choosing to draw from, where you're relying on for your information. In this day and age, everyone wants to jump to some of the sort of convenient solutions, and that is certainly exploited. I'm watching it today in real time with this case in New Jersey, where the federal judge's husband and son were attacked, and the son has been killed, and the immediate reaction is to assign it to a conspiracy regarding a case that was on the docket, and it just takes off like wildfire, and it gets way ahead of the facts, and it's a challenge that we have not done a good job solving, and so it's not going to be. It's just up to each individual to be reliant. I guess the one thing I would point out is that in some of the research done in regards to the 2016 election, that the most effective way to knock it down is with peer groups. Folks will believe something that is confirmational if they read it online of what they already believe or are inclined to believe, but that the best way to counter that is with peers, folks that they trust in their day-to-day lives. And so, that's where it's also up to us, to work with our peer groups to make sure that folks aren't running down some of these rabbit holes.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to give Jim and Stu a minute to think about my next question while I then ask John Warner. So heads up for John Warner. But Jim and Stu, we're coming to the top of the hour, so I want to be sensitive to everyone's schedules and time today. So I would love for you to both think about, from your perspective, what question did none of us ask today that you really think we should have asked so that you could answer it, kind of in the spirit of advice or a consideration or a thought. So if both of you can give that just a moment to think about, and in the meantime, while you're thinking about your answer to that, John Warner, welcome, and thank you for offering to share maybe some hope and inspiration on the horizon with the work that you're up to with Path Checks to help our guests today feel comfortable about responsible and ethical applications of contact tracing that should make us all feel, so we can end on a positive, so we can all feel more comfortable while Jim and Stu are thinking about kind of their last thought for the group.
Great, Julie, it's great to hear you. It feels like back in college when you were leading a lot of the study groups, you were always the smartest kid in the class, and thanks for facilitating this so well. And Jim, it's good to see you. I know we have a mutual friend. I saw you at Commerce a few times. And Stu, sounds like you're at the forefront of privacy, and thank you. These are really weird times. There's a triopoly of companies that have all this data on us, and we need people that really understand the ramifications of that. So my day job, I'm a venture capitalist and run an incubator, but on the side, I'm working with a professor who managed a team of 50 on privacy at Apple last summer. And before that was a scientist at Facebook, and before that was at Microsoft, and before that was at Google X. And this MIT professor was really worried about the surveillance state. And we formed an organization called Path Checks, which began as a movement to develop free, open source, privacy first tools for COVID. And it's to prevent the surveillance state and respond to the pandemic. And we created a foundation. We've raised about $2.5 million. And we're here to help nations, states, and employers to put their own custom solutions, an app, a server, and a dashboard together. This is a nonprofit. And we're creating this tool to augment and simplify manual contact tracing, exposure notification, case interviews, and contact follow-up. And we're using the privacy preserving solutions for the users. And we have two arms. We have a software team building software that we're going to scale. And then we have a think tank that's really thinking about this. And, you know, these are exciting times. And I didn't want to be on the sideline as this was happening. So I said, let me see if I can help. There are 5 of us who are board members, and we're getting a lot of traction. And we have some countries that are starting to use it, like Guam and Italy. And we have some school districts, University of New Hampshire that we're working with, and we're trying to create a tool that can be used.
Thanks, John. And I would encourage, if anybody has any questions about the Path Checks initiative or any other, certainly reach out to Jim, Stu, me, or John, and we connect you with people that we know in our network to learn more and maybe participate in a proactive way in some of these responsible solutions, because I think you can tell certainly all of us believe that there are responsible pathways forward to do this right and to balance both consumer privacy with the public health and common good in a broader sense. I sent a note. There's one question from Andy Steele. I'm going to pass it to you. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for this discussion, Stu and Jim. It's really great to hear about all these issues. We've got 36 plus smart people on the phone, on the call, or 35 in me. But I'm like Jim. I've worked at Commerce and been on the Internet Policy Task Force and issues. So I really appreciate that we have people with all these different perspectives. We're kind of triangulating on this issue of privacy and also security, because if you don't have privacy, you're going to have security problems. I guess my question is, thinking about the US environment, we are the fountain of innovation for the internet economy, and yet the internet is a global medium. And so I want to make sure that we avoid something like a splinter net, where California has the Consumer Privacy Act and Illinois has a biomedical law and Massachusetts is doing something different. Or conversely, you're looking at sectoral information, education, healthcare, COPPA for children. How do we make sure that is the most efficient way, both for consumers, but also for businesses? I'm thinking about in Europe, the Privacy Shield Act was just struck down this week. And I knew 5,000 companies in the United States were using that to transfer personal data. So that's a business risk that I find really challenging. And I'm just wondering how you guys think moving forward, we're going to generate sort of a more reliable solution for people. Thank you so much.
Andy, thank you. That's a great question. And Stu, as I'm going to pass it to you first as an expert in internet law, since this is right up your alley, particularly in that global context. Can you answer? And then Jim, I'll give it to you if you have additional thoughts.
Well, it's a great question. I wish I had a better answer or an answer for it. I just offer an observation. I mean, it's obviously very challenging, and there's any number of examples, and I think that they're just going to increase as time moves on. But there are not really any good examples in the history of Western or society where you have every country following the same set of rules. And so the notion that we're going to be able to achieve that here, given that we can't even achieve it in one state or one town, but the notion that we're going to achieve that level of harmony across the world, I think is not likely. And so I think we need to figure out ways to recognize the differences. Maybe it is technologies that can help navigate the differences in a more seamless way, but I don't think you're going to be able to change kind of the socioeconomic views of different parts of the world to all harmonize.
Jim.
So I just make a couple of observations. You know, the fact is that much of the privacy in the United States is dictated by corporate standards, by a patchwork of 50 plus different breach notification laws that each individual state has implemented and territories. And then, you know, the patchwork at the federal level is really sort of specific to different things. Federal privacy protection is focused on federal employees, HIPAA for health information. You know, the information that is protected in a very disaggregated way in the United States. And, you know, that was part of the challenge for building up Safe Harbor and then building up the Privacy Shield and ensuring the Europeans that the United States valued it as much. So I think that, you know, one of the pieces would be, you know, the demand for a federal privacy bill to standardize a bunch of this, to simplify so that you don't have 50 different notification standards. Because, you know, like the disease, commerce is not necessarily going to respect these state boundaries. So when you're collecting information on different customers, they're going to be from all over. So it's a challenge, and it's a huge regulatory burden for especially small companies and folks who, you know, want to do the work to collect the information, to do the data analytics on the back end and figure out, you know, how to better market their products. It's a big challenge, and I think it relies on us saying that this is important and putting it up to mandate that there be sort of federal action on this front.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so that everybody knows, you have some significant bias here with Jim, Stu, and me on the requirement for federal privacy action. We're all big advocates, and I'm a big fan of the work that Stu and Venable has done to help many organizations with the Privacy for America initiative. They do have a website. I would encourage people to go and read more. It will make you feel so much better that there are really smart people thinking about what's right for all of us, whether or not we're thanking them for the work they're doing day in and day out. There's a question from a guest. I hope you guys maybe can give us another 5 or 10 minutes. It's related to someone says, as someone in the basic health sciences space, it is interesting to me the difference between privacy in the commerce world and that in HIPAA regulations. I think contact tracing bridges into the health privacy area, and those requirements are very strict. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's very, the differences are stark. I think a lot of what we're talking about here would fall out of, or could fall out of, the healthcare regulations. Just the type of data, who's providing it, who's using it, where the tests are being done. So I think if it were covered information under HIPAA, then that stricter panoply of rules would follow. And, you know, I'm not sure, though, that that's even the best construct for, because there's a lot of opt-in and consents for use of data in that world. And I don't think that's going to work here, just given the time frame. And you know, I think there's some level of law or broader law that could or should happen. I think is unlikely. And I think the other approach is what, I don't know enough about it, but what I think John described, in the technological ways of achieving those same outcomes, I think, are the hopes.
So Jim and Stu, again, I want to be sensitive to time. You know, we didn't speak too much about data security, cybersecurity. I think we had a wonderful conversation, though. There's so much to be explored here. We can probably work with the HCN group to find others to cover those topics in the future. But what would a closing thought be? And I hope both of you can help us end on a high with like I said, the hope on the horizon. Yeah, what would you, from your perspective, related to contact tracing, but even more broadly, data usage, the governance around it, what closing thoughts would you like to share with everybody here?
To your question about what do I think might have been asked, thinking about the false positive rate, right? So if all of a sudden, you know, one of these programs is implemented. The app is ubiquitous. And I'd say that there are some other examples, right? We push out information about flooding. We push out information about, Amber Alerts for missing children. So if we're pushing out information about, you've been exposed to COVID, what happens when all of those wind up being false, right? If you're just really diligent about wearing your mask, washing your hands, and sort of being outside and keeping your distance, but you've come into contact with it. I guess that part of this would be your proximity to a hotspot. You'd probably be more likely to get a bunch of false positives if you were in a spot that had many more active cases. But, how do you not let that undermine the system? How do you not let that sort of drive folks away and say, I just spent 14 days in quarantine for no reason whatsoever, or get folks sort of jaded on this concept. So I do think that that's something that policymakers will have to think about, as we get closer to having one of these be realistic. In terms of what I see as positive, that there's a lot of innovation happening here, from what John is doing to, there's actually another program at MIT too, the PACT program. They are, putting privacy first in what they're trying to achieve here, and recognizing that that's an important underpinning for the success of this program. I also think that we're in a place where you can inspire folks to be accepting of this as means of combating a once in a generation challenge, and in the name of getting their kids back to school and returning to normalcy. So you do have an opportunity to work with the governed to build something that is, that meets the moment and it isn't overly burdensome or problematic.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks to both you and John for the shout out for the vibrancy of the data and tech field in Boston there. It's going to be the new Silicon Valley or something, I think, right? We're all saying.
The old tech corridor.
Exactly. Stu, closing thoughts.
So I am optimistic, in the necessity is the mother of all invention approach. I think we're going to get some real leadership, whether it's through elections or business leaders or technology leaders. I think will step up and deliver solutions that are going to both solve this particular situation, probably sometime in the first part of next year, and I think better prepare us in the future for similar scenarios, and I think hopefully increase the recognition of the importance of science in advancing the world.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. I agree. I'm a big believer too. Both of you really in the spirit of necessity being the mother of invention and the innovation that's out there. Also inspired very much by a lot of the public-private partnerships that we're seeing. There really are a lot of people that are thinking more for the greater good than for the malicious intent. And so I hope for everybody that you've enjoyed our panel today. My huge thanks, I know not only personally, but on behalf of everyone, both to you, Jim and Stu, for joining us. Shauna, to you and the team that's supporting you from Hamilton and the Career Network. This was great for us to participate in, and thank you for welcoming us all here today. And with that, I have no other questions in our group chat. I will leave you all to enjoy the rest of your Monday and the rest of your week, and wish everybody safety and good health and well-being during these unprecedented times.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you all.
Bye, Shauna.
Julie Bernard for president.
Thanks, John Warner. Bye, everyone.
Bye.